All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Susan M. Hart Servideo. I'm from the Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Ocean County, and thank you for joining us tonight with Pests in the Vegetable Garden. With us tonight, panelists, so I have Patty Dixon, other horticulturist in the office. I have Phyllis Delisandro, who's also helping us out with Q&A because we have 342 of you that had registered for our program tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. I would like to, we're going to hold the questions pretty much till the end unless there's something that needs to be clarified during Pete's talk. But I want to say welcome, Peter Nietzsche from Morris County as an agriculture agent up there. And your specialty is vegetables, right? Crops?
Yes, vegetables and small fruit like strawberries.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to let you take it away, Pete, because otherwise we'll get sidetracked.
Okay, thanks, Susan.
Yep.
So I am here to talk tonight about pests in the vegetable garden. And whenever we're talking about pests in the vegetable garden to gardeners and farmers, we always emphasize an integrated pest management approach. We know we can't eliminate pests, but we want to manage them to a level that's acceptable so that we can still get our crops and eat them and have acceptable crops. But what integrated pest management involves utilizing every tool at your disposal, be it cultural, physical, mechanical, biological, and usually what we consider in the home garden the last resort, chemical control to keep pests at those acceptable levels. So some examples we'll go through as we get into the specific pests, some of the techniques that work for specific pests that might plague your vegetable garden. Sometimes we can utilize resistant varieties, a very inexpensive way by choosing in the catalogs or the variety labels. Varieties that are resistant usually applies to diseases, but occasionally an insect, some are resistant or less attractive usually to insects. We want to be out culturally inspecting plants, looking at the growing tips and underside of leaves and catching problems and issues early on. Hopefully, after this talk, you can identify them some of yourselves, but otherwise, you can avail yourself to cooperative extension offices and master gardener helplines to help identify the pests. Crop rotation is something that farmers we highly encourage utilizing gardeners as well. It can be more challenging in a small space at a vegetable garden, but the idea of crop rotation is with most vegetable crops, they're an annual crop, and so they complete their cycle in 1 year. And we encourage gardeners to move things around in their garden. So if you planted tomatoes on one end of the garden in 2022, we encourage you to move those tomatoes to another spot in the garden and rotate them around and move them by crop family. So tomatoes are related to eggplant and peppers. So you wouldn't want eggplant or peppers in the same spot. But the idea here is that some diseases overwinter as spores that fall in the soil. And so if you plant the tomato plant there, the spores are right there. And we'll give you examples of that to splash up on the crop if we plant them in the same spot. If we move it, there's less spores, less chance of being infected. Sometimes insects will feed on a crop and lay eggs in the area underneath the crop. And so if we put it in the same spot, the eggs hatch or the overwintering adults come out and they don't have far to walk to attack your tomatoes. If we move them to the other end of the garden, maybe a toad or a bird eats them on the way, or maybe we hope they go to our neighbor that we don't like so much and eat their tomato plants. Um, so we do this by family, move them around, trying because most families of crops get similar pests. So we move them around and try not to plant onions, allium or onions and garlic in the same spot every year and move them around as best as possible. We recommend 2 or 3 years if you can. Um, Oftentimes in a smaller vegetable garden that might be problematic. In that case, we might rely a little more on sanitation. So if you have heavily disease infected material or insect ridden material, you might want to get that up and out of the garden. You can put it in a compost pile, but it has to be a very hot compost pile in order to break it down. So it might be better to put it compost pile that's going into the flower garden, which wouldn't have the same crop that you would in your vegetable garden. And then otherwise, good cultural practices we recommend through the extension office, proper fertilization by a soil test, proper watering are all keys to get the plant growing stronger and better able to resist pests. Some mechanical controls I'll talk about as we go through the specific pests. Sometimes collars help to keep things out. Screens or row covers we'll mention a few times. Occasionally mulches help a bit. And then if you're not too squeamish and you're out there inspecting, sometimes we can just use our finger and toes and mechanically remove those insect pests off your vegetable crop. Biological control is going on in your garden, whether you know it or you're not. And through my presentation, you'll notice numbers here. These are typically fact sheet numbers, and we'll give you, I think Suzanne gave you the web link, and we'll give you at the end where all these fact sheets are on our extension website. So avail yourself to those. But this particular fact sheet talks about all the beneficial insects that are in your vegetable garden, helping to control other insects. So there are good bugs and bad bugs, and so we look for insects that eat pests. The one probably a lot of people know are ladybird beetles here eating aphids. We'll talk about in a second. But there's other insects, some lacewings, some tiny wasps that don't sting you, but that sting other insects, etc. These are all beneficials that we want to keep around in our garden and encourage. I do have here another example of what many people consider a beneficial praying mantis. They are okay, okay if they're in your garden. You don't need to get rid of them, but they're a general predator. So whereas a ladybird beetle will generally go after other pests, a praying mantis will go after a ladybird beetle if they find it. They'll go after their brothers and sisters and eat them if you have an egg case and they have nothing else to eat. So you can leave them in your garden. I wouldn't buy that as a beneficial. Some supply places sell them. I'd be more inclined to buy ladybird beetles. However, I'm even more inclined to plant a few flowers around the vegetable garden to enhance biological control. So many of the beneficial insects get their protein meal from other insects, and they get their carbohydrates and from nectar meals of certain flowers. And so this is a list of flowers that often attract beneficials. And this was actually a list utilized by one of our researchers who had grad students plant all these flowers and then count the insects and catch the insects that were going to the flowers. And in order, he was looking at trying to find beneficials to control certain pepper pests. And in this case, dill, fennel, coriander, and buckwheat were the most attractive to the beneficial insects that control pepper pests. And just to show that this works by research, they planted a plot of peppers on one side of the research farm with the row of these flowers next to it that attract beneficials, which were loaded with ladybird beetles and hoverflies and other beneficials, and then they planted another plot without the flowers next to it. And they got better control in the plot with the flowers next to it. There was better control of insect pests in the peppers than there was in the field that had no flowers nearby. So the take home is it's definitely good to plant some flowers around your vegetable garden to attract beneficials and enhance control that way. And the final, like we said, typically what's considered the last resort, or can be one of the most expensive techniques in the home vegetable garden, is pesticides. I will mention what most people think of conventional or synthetic pesticides that many gardeners avoid. And then I'll mention some organic materials that can also be applied. In either case, we always want to stop and read the label and use pesticides wisely as a tool and carefully. We want to stop and read the label, and particularly if we're utilizing any kind of chemical, be it organic or synthetic, on a food crop, and make sure you're checking on that label the pre-harvest interval, the time where after you spray, you wait for water, light to break down the chemical before you wash it and pick it and consume it. So make sure you follow the label very carefully with rates, et cetera, to make sure if you're going to use a chemical in the home vegetable garden, you're using it safely and wisely. And two fact sheets that we have. One, it lists all the insecticides we recommend, both organic and synthetic, for the home vegetable garden, and then also the fungicides that we would suggest or recommended for the home garden use if you choose to do so. So let's start off with tomatoes. We'll cover some general pests and then some specific pests that you'd likely to encounter with tomatoes in the home vegetable garden. And one general pest that you'll encounter on tomatoes, as well as many other crops, are small sucking insects, soft-bodied. They are called aphids. They do like the growing tips of plants and the underside of the leaves. This is one of the ones that we want you to be out looking at your garden, finding these pests early on, and also turning underside leaves, looking at growing tips. You know, on the top of this leaf, it doesn't look that bad. However, if we turn it over, we see lots of aphids, and we want to try and catch these aphids and that infestation early on before they become a problem. One or two aphids sucking on a plant are not a big deal, but they don't usually stay one or two for very long. They reproduce very rapidly, and some species only produce females, and they produce pregnant females. So they go from one or two to 1 or 200 very quickly to 2 or 3,000, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem with them, they suck the juices from the plants, and they can also spread virus diseases in the home vegetable garden. So what can we do about them? One of the things that will knock them off the plants and damage them because they're pretty soft is a forceful stream of water. So you want to hit a plant. If we had that eggplant seedling that had all those aphids on it, we can rinse it, bring it to a hose, rinse it vigorously, not so much to harm the eggplant, but to wash those off. We can do that once or twice, and hopefully we knock them back and get rid of them. An interesting cultural control of aphids that growers have utilized on occasion is foil mulch. So growers often put out different types of mulch, black plastic mulch, and in this case, it's a plastic mulch with a foil coating on it, so like a mylar balloon, which reflects, highly reflective in the light. And research has shown that aphids tend not to land on the plants within this foil mulch. Mechanism is not totally understood, whether they think the sky is up or confuses their orientation. Kind of hard to ask an aphid what they're feeling, but it has been effective. So it's an interesting cultural technique that some growers have utilized, particularly with squash, where they get aphids that spread some devastating viruses. Some organic insecticides that can be utilized on aphids. Insecticidal soap is a natural fatty acid that can be sprayed on certain soft-bodied insects like aphids. It erodes their outside skin and dehydrates them, and so you can get some control with that material, and that's considered organic. Another material, azadirachtin, derivative botanical insecticide, derivative of a neem tree, can be sprayed, and it repels and kills aphids. Some of these synthetic materials are labeled for different crops, so if you're going to utilize those, make sure they're labeled for the particular crop you want to utilize them on. Again, the forceful stream of water, insecticidal soap, and other things are usually sufficient to control the aphids. The other thing I should add to this slide is really attracting those beneficials. The challenge sometimes is the aphid population gets ahead of them, but we definitely want those flowers around, those ladybird beetles, lacewings, and others to keep the aphid population in check. Another tiny soft-bodied insect that gets on tomatoes and some other crops are whiteflies. Sometimes you'll see them as you walk down the row of tomatoes and you brush the plant, and you'll see all these little white things fly up, and that's a whitefly. There's several species that get on different crops in the vegetable garden. As you can see here, there's a cabbage whitefly shown here. That'll affect them. Again, tiny sucking pests like aphids. The challenge is the populations build, and when they're in large numbers, they can damage the crop. Many of the species don't overwinter outdoors except the cabbage one, and sometimes we'll see that on overwintering kale and other crops. And we usually recommend you get that under control, because if you go ahead and plant your next cabbage crop, you're going to have an early infestation of whitefly. Some of the things you can do to control whitefly is apply floating row covers to screen them out. And this is an example of floating row covers applied to over eggplant. There was a research trial looking at different organic controls, actually in this case for flea beetle, but it was put over eggplant. And floating row covers allow air, water, and light through, but they have holes tiny enough that it screens out insects. So the key, though, with floating row covers is that you put them over a crop that's already clean. In this case, in this trial, we had a problem because there was aphids underneath the row cover, and they got under there and damaged the eggplant. And once you're underneath the row cover, none of the beneficials can come in to consume the insects. So you have to start with clean plants. Floating row covers can be put on things like lettuce and other crops and carrots and things that have the growing tip at the bottom. However, for plants like eggplant and tomato with the growing tip at top, usually you have to support it. And this has, we're utilizing wire hoops to support the row cover there. So it can work, but again, put it out with clean plants that there's nothing underneath. Since there's small and soft-bodied, insecticidal soap is another material that can help to control whiteflies. And then another botanical insecticide is pyrethrum. It's a derivative of a daisy-like plant that can be applied and has been found to be an effective insecticide. The problem with pyrethrums is that they break down very rapidly in UV light, and so the control lasts a very short period of time. Because of this, researchers have manipulated the chemistry of the compound and created pyrethroids, where synthetic materials, not considered organic, last longer in the environment, don't break down as quickly, but are effective insecticides. With both of these materials, they're somewhat harsh on beneficials, and so we don't want to do a lot of applications of either the botanical organic material or the synthetic material, or we can actually knock back the beneficials and create a worse situation. So the population's high, maybe hit them once with the pyrethrum or pyrethroids, and then move on to other control measures. Moving up in size and a more specific pest of tomatoes is the tomato hornworm, a very large caterpillar, gets 3 to 4 inches long, has this horn at the back. That's where it gets its name. And this is the tomato hornworm with these V-shaped markings along the side. Does a lot of chewing damage of tomato plants. And this is a related species called the tobacco hornworm. I tend to see more tobacco hornworms in New Jersey than at the tomato plants, but both are very large caterpillars from a very large moth that lays its eggs on the tomato plants. And they start out small, but grow very rapidly, chewing on your tomatoes. And if you can find them, they're not too hard to hand pick off the plant. You'll notice that they tend to be the same color of a tomato plant, and they tend to hide underneath the leaves, so they can be difficult to find. I usually try and track the damage they've done back a little bit, and then I also sometimes look for their large excrement from all their chewing. They're coming out the other end with their excrement. So that's kind of the clues in order to find them, to hand pick them off. The good news on tomato hornworm is that there's usually not a ton in the home vegetable garden, and that's because of a specific beneficial insect, a natural predator called a braconid wasp that flies around. It lays its eggs on tomato hornworms. The eggs hatch, and the larvae burrow into the tomato worm, feeding on the insides. And this tomato hornworm has cocoons of the braconid wasp on its back, and is not feeling so well because it's had its insides eaten out. So often, if gardeners find tomato hornworms with the cocoons, they leave them knowing that the wasps are going to hatch out soon. Tomato hornworms not eating anymore, and they'll go off and control more tomato hornworms. As far as organic insecticides, Bacillus thuringiensis is a natural bacteria that produces a toxin, a stomach toxin for caterpillars. And it's very effective on caterpillars. Commercial growers and organic growers utilize it. It's very effective on a lot of caterpillars. And so it provides control. It's not something that harms humans. It harms the alkaline stomach of caterpillars, and humans have acidic stomachs. So it's very effective for controlling caterpillar pests. But what you want to make sure you're always doing with any of these materials is you're only spraying them on plant you're trying to protect, the crop you're trying to protect, because BT is effective on all caterpillars. And so you wouldn't want to spray it on your milkweed if you want to see monarch butterflies, as it would control a monarch butterfly larva. Another larva that you may or may not look to control is the larva of the black swallowtail butterfly, which is another attractive butterfly that flies around your garden. The other names for this larva, though, are celery worm and parsley worm, and they also eat dill and fennel. So if you're trying to protect your dill and fennel, you might spray it. If you want to see butterflies, you don't want to spray them all. But it is, so that's one of those kind of choices you make in your garden, whether you're trying to manage for the parsley and celery or how many butterflies you want to see. But the take home on here is that even though it's an organic material, it's toxic to something, particularly caterpillars, and we don't want to spray it all over the garden. We just want to spray it on the plants we're trying to protect. Spinosad is another newer organic insecticide that can be used on certain pests. It's the product of a bacteria fermentation, and the bacteria was discovered by a researcher in an old rum distillery in the Caribbean, which is likely how it gets the one company calls it Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew that sells it to home gardeners, kind of relating back to that rum distillery find. But it's a compound that's very effective on certain insects, and again is used by a lot of organic farmers because it's a natural material considered organic, and can be utilized. And most between the wasps, the hand picking, BT, most gardeners don't have to resort to synthetic insecticide to control tomato hornworm. We don't always see tomato hornworms every year in the garden, but I tend to see this problem just about every year in everyone's garden. And that's some problems caused by fungal diseases. Leaf blights of tomatoes cause the plant to start to die, and it works its way from the bottom up. If we go midway here between the dead foliage and the green foliage and look closer at the leaves, we'll often see spots. In this case, about a ½ inch round brown spots with target-shaped rings in the middle of it, and that's early blight of tomato. We may find other spots that are a little bit smaller, about an 1/8 of an inch round, with light colored centers and little black dots in the middle, tiny white dots that you'd have to see with a magnifying glass, and that's septoria leaf spot. Both of these are called leaf blights. They're fungus diseases, and one of the keys is that they overwinter as spores in the soil and on crop debris. Some of the things you can do to manage tomato leaf blight: you can look for some tolerant varieties. There's not really any what we consider totally resistant varieties that never get it. But there's some varieties bred through breeding programs in North Carolina and Cornell, Mountain Merit, Defiant Iron Lady. Mountain Magic is more of a Campari type, a smaller tomato. Plum Regal, a plum. Juliet, a large grape. And Jasper, a cherry. So if you have a lot of problems with tomato leaf blights, you might want to take advantage of some of these tolerant varieties. Picture doesn't really do this justice, but a few years ago, I was at a farm, an organic farm, and they had a lot of heirloom tomatoes in their field, and they had Mountain Magic here growing, and many of the heirlooms were losing a lot of their foliage, whereas Mountain Magic, that Campari type tomato, was green from top to bottom. Next to it was also Iron Lady, which is supposed to be highly resistant to the leaf blights. However, a lot of people don't like the horticulture or culinary aspects of Iron Lady, so not really pushing that particular variety, but it is resistant to or tolerant, I should say, to these diseases. We mentioned crop rotation. This is one of the reasons to move things around, because the spores overwinter in the soil. So move your tomatoes around to different spots in the garden. Try not to go back into the same spot. Both of these diseases thrive on leaf wetness. So the longer the leaves stay wet during the day, the more likely they're going to get these diseases. And so if anything we can do, like caging, staking, getting the plant up off the ground, will help it dry out quicker. We want to water in the morning so it dries out, or watering from below, soaker hoses, or directing your water just to the root system, not wetting the foliage all day long, is going to improve the dryness of the plant and help to manage the leaf blight diseases. And then if you can't rotate and get good air circulation, and if you have a lot of disease, again, we might want to get that disease material up and out of the garden at the end of the year. So, and into a hot compost, or a compost that's not going back right to the vegetable tomato garden, so that it's not spreading those diseases back into the soil. Most gardeners, I would say most gardeners grow tomatoes. They do well during the season. They get an acceptable crop, and they're getting infected heavily with early blight and septoria. About the same time, they're dying back in the fall from frost, and so most gardeners don't resort to fungicides. Um, and again, that may depend on the weather conditions of the year. If we have a very rainy year, we're going to see more disease, and gardeners will get less yield and be more disappointed. If we have a dry year, gardeners will be more successful. They'll have less blight, and do it that way. But if you have a lot of problems and want to protect your tomatoes from the leaf blight diseases, you can utilize fungicides. Some forms of copper fungicides are considered organic, and so they can be sprayed on the leaves. And fungicides are a little bit different typically than insecticides, in that they usually have to be applied as a protective coating on the leaf before you'd see the disease problem. Usually with insecticides, we're waiting, identifying the pest, and then spraying the pest. In this case, the fungicide has to be on before we even see the symptoms of the disease, usually a couple weeks after flowering, and then the label will tell us the specific rate and then how often to apply, usually something like every 7 to 10 days, depending on weather. If it's rainier, it's washing it off. It needs to be applied more often. If it's drier, then you can stretch out your fungicide applications a little bit further. So there's organic forms of copper, and there's synthetic, and then chlorothalonil and mancozeb are common synthetic fungicides sold for that. Again, a lot of gardeners don't do that. I don't do a whole lot of spraying like that in my home garden. It's the kind of the last thing I want to do when I get home from work. This is a problem that's often confused with a disease. It looks very much like a disease, so I like to talk about it so that gardeners are familiar with it and recognize that it's actually a physiological disorder called blossom end rot, which is very common when we don't have enough moisture, and we have dry years. We'll see a lot of blossom end rot. I see a lot of blossom end rot on plum tomatoes. And the issue is that calcium moves with water from the roots in the soil up into the plant, up into the flowers and the fruit. And anything that disrupts that water movement, like a droughty year, dryness, slows the water movement, slows the movement of calcium into the fruit and then causes blossom end rot on the bottom of the fruit. We also see a lot of blossom end rot in containers, and that's usually because we see gardeners with a very large tomato plant in a small container. They may water it in the morning and it's dried out by the evening, disrupting that water movement and calcium movement. So what can you do to control blossom end rot? Usually there's enough calcium in the soil, and it's just not moving into the plant. But again, this is why we recommend a soil test from your extension office through our website. Get your soil tested, know that if you have enough calcium, you're fine. If not, you might want to add calcitic lime. There's two types of lime, dolomitic and calcitic. And so you want to look for the material that contains calcium, which will assist with blossom end rot control. But typically more important is controlling soil moisture, mulching to even out the moisture, watering more often. If you're growing in containers, use a bigger container, or if you have to be gone during the day, maybe a self-watering container to make sure the tomato plant gets consistent water. Moving on to peppers, talk about one general pest that can get on, and showing it on peppers here. Some shredding of the leaves, and in this case, we don't really see the pest. And sometimes that happens with snails and slugs, in that they'll come out on at night or on rainy days when we're not out in the garden, come out and chew and chew and shred the plants. There's a lot of different species, shapes, colors, and sizes of these two organisms, snails and slugs, and gardeners have dealt with them for years and come up with all types of interesting means to battle snails and slugs. One of them is stale beer. So some gardeners put out containers, plastic containers, and bury them at the soil line and put a little stale beer in there, and that attracts the snails and slugs. And typically they fall in and drown. Some other gardeners will put out things like a piece of wood, and the snails and slugs will congregate underneath the wood. During the day, they're hiding from the sun, and so the gardener will pick up the wood and maybe take it to their bird feeder or some other place to get rid of the slugs out of the garden. An interesting thing that's sold online is copper screening. So snails and slugs don't like to crawl across copper. And so some specialty order, mail order places sell these rings that can be put around plants or a collar, and creating a mechanical barrier that the snails and slugs don't want to cross to get to the plant. One of the challenges with that is copper is very expensive, so those rings are fairly expensive, and you got to watch that your neighborhood folks are not taking advantage of that free copper sitting in your garden, or if you're in a community garden, that might be not the best place to utilize the copper screening. Some other ways to control snails and slugs. Diatomaceous earth is sold as an insecticide and slugicide. It's tiny remnants of diatoms, which when looked under a microscope are very sharp. So it comes looking like a white powder that can be dusted around plants, and snails and slugs don't like to cross that barrier because of the sharpness of that material. Has to be replenished when when it rains, and replenished, but it does create an effective barrier against snails and slugs. They do also sell it for pool filters, and from what I understand, that's sold or treated in a way that it's not effective for slug control. So stick with the material labeled, has directions on how to use it for slugs or other insects, soil-borne insects. Don't buy the pool filter material. There's also two fairly new baits for slugs, organic baits. One's an iron phosphate bait, it goes under the trade name Sluggo, and sodium ferric EDTA, Corey's material, that can be placed around plants. The slugs are attracted to the material and consume it and are killed by the bait. And so those are also effective slugicides. And then there's a couple of synthetic ones that have been sold for years. Moving into eggplants. One devastating pest of eggplants. It causes this defoliating damage, and that is the Colorado potato beetle. Even though it's called potato beetle, it actually likes eggplant the best. Then second, probably potatoes, then tomatoes, and then peppers as well it'll feed on. But this is the beetle, about a half an inch long with this black and yellow stripes that comes out of the ground in the winter after the winter rest, lays its eggs on the underside of a leaf of an eggplant. The larvae hatch out into feeding machines and can quickly devastate and defoliate peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, and potatoes. The larvae feed on the leaves. They have 2 generations per year, so they go from egg, they come out as an adult, lay eggs, mature into larva, into an adult, lay eggs again. And so that's what we mean by 2 generations a year. And they are a very devastating pest and have been for farmers because they become resistant to many pesticides. So we try and work again with farmers and gardeners to do an integrated approach, not to use just same chemical over and over and over again. And if you do that, sometimes some of the insects survive, and actually, particularly Colorado potato beetle has the genetic potential to be resistant to many pesticides. And so if you apply the same chemistry over and over, be it organic or synthetic, chances are the insect will become resistant, and then that material will be no longer effective. So we encourage farmers and gardeners to do other approaches and mix up chemistries if you're going to use chemicals. What can you do to manage Colorado potato beetle? You can hand pick them off. If you find the adults early on is the best timing so that you don't have any generation in your home vegetable garden, pick them off. Also, if you can find those orange eggs underneath the leaves, get rid of those and or the larva. This is one case where some research showed a heavy straw mulch underneath the plants really inhibited that first generation from getting out of the soil. Not sure whether they get trapped in the straw or they may become infected with this natural fungus of insects, Bavaria. And so whatever it is, a heavy straw mulch around eggplant or potatoes can inhibit that first generation and give you some management and control. Because they overwinter in the soil, you could utilize floating row covers, but you must combine it with crop rotation, because if you had a crop there last year, there's probably adults in the soil and they're going to hatch out or crawl out underneath the row cover and devastate your plants before you know it. And so floating row covers should be combined with crop rotation. We mentioned BT earlier on caterpillars. There's a different strain of BT, Tenebrianus, that is effective on Colorado potato beetle. It's only effective on small larvae, so you have to apply it early on for that to be effective. This Bavaria material is a natural fungus that affects certain insects, and it can affect Colorado potato beetle, can be somewhat effective on that. It's also one of the materials they're looking at for some level of spotted lanternfly control. And then we talked a little bit earlier about pyrethrins and spinosyn. A tinier beetle that goes after eggplant creates tiny little holes, doesn't defoliate the plant, are flea beetles, about a 1/16 of an inch long. There's several species. Some get on eggplants, some get on cole crops. They lay their eggs in the soil, and the adults overwinter in protected places. And they are one insect that likes mild winters. So if we get mild winter, which more than mostly we had last year, we had one cold spell, but otherwise it was pretty mild. I expect to see kind of a lot of flea beetles because the winter did not kill many of them off, likely with the conditions we had. They kind of jump when disturbed, and they have 2 generations in New Jersey. Some things, this was the pest we were trying to control with those hoops on that eggplant trial in an earlier slide. So floating row covers combined with crop rotation, because they lay their eggs in the soil and overwinter in areas around there. So combined with crop rotation, so they're not coming out, hatching out underneath the row cover. And this is something a couple of gardeners have told me they've done, and does jive a little bit with science, in that they've put floating row cover more as a fence around their eggplants as opposed to covering the whole thing. And the idea here is that flea beetles are not really good flyers. They jump, they crawl more. And so this creates a barrier for them to get up onto the plants and keeps them out, and then still allows some beneficial insects to fly in and control other insect problems like aphids. So some gardeners have had fairly good success with that, just creating a fence kind of barrier around their eggplant. We mentioned this Bavaria natural fungus of insects, neem insecticidal soap, are all things that have some level of effectiveness on flea beetles. Although I have gardeners tell me all the time that they struggle getting flea beetles under control. Hot pepper wax, which is the hot material in hot peppers, um, is also effective on flea beetles. From what I've seen, what the material that's sold in the stores is not labeled for organic. I'm not sure if there's an additive or they just haven't gone through organic certification, but it does have to fall under synthetic insecticides, even though the material in it is typically consumed in hot peppers and probably wouldn't be very toxic to, except if you don't want a really hot pepper. But it's not technically considered organic, but probably a pretty benign material to apply in your home garden. Moving on to the cold crops, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts are all in the same family, have similar pest problems, the most common of which is a caterpillar pest that you can see here on a cabbage head, and you see another one over here. Starts off very small. It is the larva of this little sulfur-colored butterfly that flutters around the garden, laying eggs on your cole crops, which hatch into the larvae that feed on your cabbage, put holes in them, and get about an inch long. Oops. One of the things you can do is hand pick them. Unfortunately, though, they are the same color of the plant, so sometimes they're hard to find, and they also get up into the heads of broccoli and cauliflower. And so sometimes if we're not really good about hand picking them, we end up with some protein in the pot at the end of the growing season when we harvest. Most growers utilize Bacillus thuringiensis very effectively to control cabbage worm. I guess I could also put on here floating row covers would also keep the butterfly from flying around and laying its eggs on the cabbage plants. So those are typical between hand picking, BT, and floating row covers are good, effective cabbage worm control measures. Moving on to cucurbits, some of the common pests that get on those. One of the common questions or concerns we get in the home vegetable garden is from gardeners first growing zucchini, and they have good success getting a plant going, and it's growing for a long period of time. They might harvest a zucchini or two, and then all of a sudden it starts to wilt and die, even though there's plenty of moisture in the soil. If they go down closer to the stem, they'll often see some sawdust-like material, some frass, maybe some holes in the stem. And if they cut open that stem, they'll find the culprit, the squash vine borer, the larva of a clearwing moth that crawls around and chews the inside and kills all the water conducting tissue of the squash plant. So the moth lays its eggs on the stem, it hatches out, burrows in, and chews on the stem. Some of the things you can do to control squash vine borer, floating row covers will keep them out for a period of time. However, we have to remember that squash and the cucurbits are typically insect pollinated. And so we'll have a male flower that's going to release the pollen, and an insect needs to move the pollen from the male flower to the female flower in order to have a typical yellow zucchini. So one way to do it is to apply the floating row cover early and remove them at flowering. And so you protect the plants for a while, and hopefully you've protected them long enough so that you don't have squash vine borer. The other option is to use a variety that is called parthenocarpic, which actually will form fruit without insect pollination. So Parthenon and Easy Pick are two varieties that are considered parthenocarpic. You have to look through the seed companies for those, but they'll be able to be kept underneath the row cover and still form fruit. We could also make several plantings. We don't want all our zucchini at once anyway, so a couple plantings during the season, and hopefully one of them does not become infected. Some gardeners have luck hand destroying squash vine borer. They slit open, if they can catch the pest early on when the vine's not all wilted down, they might be able to slice open the stem, kill the borer, and then mound up some soil. I've not had very good luck finding that very effective. As far as insecticides, all the insecticides will have trouble working once the borer gets inside the plant, and so they have to be applied early. Things like BT or spinosad around a young stem, so that hopefully they affect the larva as the egg hatches and before it burrows into the stem. Some gardeners have used injection. They've taken the BT and they use a syringe and actually inject it in the stem. And we're doing a project in Morris County looking at that, or looked at it last year in a community garden plot. It wasn't as easy as we thought to inject the BT into the stem. The stem on a small plant is hard to get the syringe and not damage the stem. And on a large plant, it's hard to get the syringe in there and inject that BT. So I think we're going to utilize the BT as a spray around the stem base this year, and then only use the BT if we see a hole in the stem and then inject it in that hole, and hopefully put the BT where the borer is in. Because again, once it gets in the stem, it's protected from the outside from being exposed to the insecticide. Similar wilting symptoms on particularly, this is a pumpkin, but particularly on cucumbers, excuse me, is again, plenty of moisture in the soil and suddenly the plant wilts and dies. That is typical symptoms of bacterial wilt, which is a bacterial disease that lives in the stomach of cucumber beetles. Here's a striped one here that is spreading the disease by feeding on the cucumbers. I get a lot of gardeners tell me the first year they get good cucumber growth, and then the second year they have trouble growing any cucumbers because they all become infected with bacterial wilt. So it's carried around in the gut of the spotted and striped cucumber beetles that are flying around feeding on your cucumbers. Again, floating row covers can keep them out. And again, you would have to remove them at flower or use at flowering in order to allow insects in to pollinate, or use a parthenocarpic variety. And one example is Diva. Actually, there's probably more cucumber varieties that are parthenocarpic that have been bred for greenhouse production. So a little easier to find than parthenocarpic cucumbers than it is for squash. There are some varieties that have less of the bitter compound cucurbitacin in cucumbers, which attracts the cucumber beetles. So you can look at different varieties listed here that may be a little bit less attractive to the beetles, and so a little bit more tolerant or resistant. And then some of the organic and synthetic insecticides we've mentioned throughout. A fungus disease of cucurbits is powdery mildew, a white-like fungus growth on the top of the leaves. If you look closely under a magnifying glass, you'll see the fungal growth. Fungal disease, it's unique in that it's more effective than some other diseases infecting plants in the drier weather. Usually comes on in late July or August on your cucurbits. Fortunately, there are some resistant or tolerant varieties of pumpkins and cucumbers, so look for those and plant resistant varieties. The disease slows down the plant and reduces your yield. And then there's one organic fungicide, potassium bicarbonate, that's been shown to be effective. Some people confuse this with baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, but it's potassium bicarbonate that you would find in specialty mail order places to control powdery mildew. The one thing I mentioned that some of the zucchini leaves have this silvery-like growth, but that's a normal look to certain varieties of zucchini, and so that's not powdery mildew, evidence of powdery mildew there. Moving on to snap beans. One pest of snap beans that is not widespread, but still around. Looks like ladybird beetles, the beneficials, but they're Mexican bean beetles. We know they're a pest because they're feeding on our beans, causing the skeleton-like damaging, sometimes leaving the veins or just chewing on the surface. There's the eggs, larva, and adult feeding on a bean leaf. The reason they're not as big a pest as they were at one time is that the researchers have gone back to the wild where they were introduced from and identified a natural predator, a wasp. And researchers do this when there's introduced pests. They go look for predators or things that keep the pest control in their native habitat. They study them, make sure they're not a problem for anything else in our area, and then they bring them back. And in this case, the wasp is reared every year in the New Jersey Department of Agriculture's beneficial insect lab, and they do releases to help go out with these wasps, for the wasps to go out and help keep Mexican bean beetle under control for the soybean and snap bean growers in the state. And we've had them come out on occasion to infestations in community gardens and release some of that. And that's what they're doing in this image here. A newer pest, allium leaf miner, is a pest of onion leeks, etc. Came in from Poland in 2015. Causes these marks on leaves, and there's the pest there, a tiny fly that lays its eggs on alliums. 2 generations per year, and the eggs are laid in April to May, and also in September to October. And the feeding can distort the roots and bulbs of onions. And there's the egg laying indication there of the allium leaf miner. Again, floating row covers is one way to keep them out. The other thing is timing your planting in late spring and harvesting before the fall can be utilized to control them. And then also sanitation. If you have that problem, you want to clean those material or get them up and out so they're not hatching out and affecting more alliums in the garden. Another leaf miner pest, a small fly that lays its eggs on spinach and beets, is the spinach leaf miner. Looks like a fly, and there's the tiny eggs, and those eggs hatch, and the larvae feed in between the 2 cell layers of the leaf, damaging both spinach and beet leaves. Floating row covers, again, keep the fly from laying its eggs. And then spinosad is an effective organic insecticide for leaf miners. And with that, close to the end here, hopefully if you control all these pests in your home vegetable garden, you end up at the end of the year with a pickup truck full of vegetables. So with that, I've left a little bit of time for vegetables. This is, again, those 2 publications, I think, were in the Q&A. But we have all those publications under our home gardening section of our publications. And if you look up vegetable gardens, lots of details on all these pests that you might encounter.
Forgot to unmute myself, sorry. Thank you, Peter. Some great questions that came in, some interesting questions as well. We've kind of got through as many as we can, so if anybody that's online, if you still have some, you can pop it in the chat, in the Q&A. One of the questions was about Colorado potato beetle. Does the neem oil, I looked up the label and it says that neem oil can control Colorado potato beetle, but do you find how effective that is? Do you know?
I've not worked with it specifically, and Colorado potato beetle is a tough pest, so it resists a lot of chemistries, and it's probably you want to hit young larva if you're going to use neem, and combine that with those other techniques of rotation and hand picking and such. Yeah, if it was highly effective, I'd see more farmers using it. I don't think they're,
Yeah. Well, and again, like you said, they're so resistant to so many things
yeah.
that it is hard to got to keep rotating different things around. Um, I know there was a one question that came up when Rashimi was asking about, you had talked about in the peppers, the foil, to put down the foil
Mulch.
cover like mulch to help with I forget one of
Aphids.
the pests.
Yeah,
Aphids, yeah.
aphids.
But he was wondering if you found that it heats up the reflective heat. If it, do you find a lot of problems with the peppers ripening too quickly, or not too quickly, but quicker than normal because of the reflected heat from the foil?
Yeah, well, it doesn't really heat up. It actually reflects the light and doesn't heat up the soil probably as much as black plastic or clear plastic will heat it up more. Um, and it's going to reflect some photosynthetic light back into the canopy. So it may speed up growth a little bit, but it's not really a heating effect. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Some of the other tricks or difficulties with it, it's sometimes that layer wears off if plants brush on it. Of course, they also grow over it, so your reflectiveness goes down too as it grows, as it covers the foil. But hopefully, you've protected it long enough to get a decent crop.
Patty, did you see any? I know there was a fruit tree question, but
Nothing new came in. We did have the question about birds on tomatoes and bunnies on
in the
bunnies
garden.
in the garden.
Yeah,
The wildlife issue is just so hard.
yes, I was about to agree with you on that. They because they're difficult to control effectively. There's lots of home remedies are not effective, and there's some other comments that people make that are inhumane types of controls that I don't recommend, or illegal, like moving animals and things. It's not typically not legal to do. So wildlife questions are difficult. Birds reflecting scare devices moved around, changed up, sometimes is effective. It's never usually 100%, but helps.
And then exclusion of some sort as best as possible. I know we talk about that, and of course that depends on the chicken wire fencing with the little extra netting for the baby bunnies, and
Yeah,
so there's it's
yeah.
just
Rodents can get in very small spaces when they want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other question that I know it's not a vegetable question, so I'm not sure if you want to tackle it. But someone had a question about apple trees, and squirrels and chipmunks are eating everything but their Macintosh apples. It was one that has 4 different grafts on the tree. And I didn't know if you know how to keep the rodents particularly off of, I mean, again, we're still in that wildlife exclusion type thing.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, and that's not a common, well, you get squirrels and things eating lots of different things and climbing up. I'm trying to think of any, I don't know, maybe looking at some of the devices that they use for bird feeders.
Yeah, I'm thinking like a baffle,
Yeah,
you sort of cone.
right.
I'm not sure.
Keeping
But
the,
if they're coming in or on the top,
yeah,
If they're
right.
coming
it's not
from the
going to
top,
help.
yeah.
If they're coming from another tree, I've not heard of them
Mhm.
eating one type of apple over another. Maybe
Yeah.
they don't like
So
the tartness of an Macintosh. I'm not sure, but
well, as funny as that is, I did do some research, and one of the state's universities had about how to attract wildlife by planting certain varieties of apples
yeah,
to bring wildlife to the garden. But that's obviously the opposite of what he wants to do. But
right.
yeah, so that was just one of those like going down the rabbit hole, um, and not sure.
We just had another question pop in. Denise missed the best date to plant squash in July to avoid squash vine borer.
Yeah, well, I don't, in my experience, there isn't a good date. We used to talk about they only fly early, and in my experience, they seem to be flying all season long. So, we used to say off before, after July 1st, but we had a demo in the teaching garden, and I think they became infected in August. So I just recommend trying multiple plantings. That way you're not harvesting all your squash at once. You're staggering your harvest, and then hopefully, you might, as you lose plants, you got new plants, kind of thing. So, but I think we planted August 17th and still got squash vine borers. So
Wow.
I'm not sure when they stop.
Mhm.
Well, and again, our weather's changing our patterns and everything, so
Yeah,
things
yeah.
could be mixing it up for us. But yeah, lots of thank yous and for the help and just lots of different. Somebody was going to try the squash, planting a trap crop for a variety of squash, so that the squash vine borers may go to the. I guess it was the Blue Hubbard. I
Yep,
think it was.
Blue
Patty, was that?
Hubbard.
That they heard that they like them more than the other, so try that first to try to keep them going elsewhere
Yeah.
from their main crop. But so we would
Right.
say to let us know.
Let us know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a new research topic for you there, Peter.
Yeah, the researchers have looked at trap crops on certain insects. I am not familiar with that one for squash vine borer, but now I'm gonna have to look into that too.
I know the other thing that you did a lot of research on recently was the staking and weaving methods for tomatoes and what to prune and not prune. And I know we're not talking about growing the actual vegetables, but do you have that? Do you remember the fact sheet off the top of your head? I just forgot to look it up in the.
I'm sorry, I don't. Yeah, but
Sorry. Okay, I'll try to put that in.
Steak and weave is, if you look on our publications list, steak and weave should get you there.
Yeah. Okay. Because I know I was like that was pretty interesting, the stuff that you kind of found about that and how to prune out the suckers and stuff. So.
Yeah, and just a FYI, we're going to be sending out the PDF of your PowerPoint. And here on this back page, publications, if you go to that website and you pretty much type in, eggplant or vegetables or, all the fact sheets from Rutgers are going to pop up. So it's a valuable resource there.
Yes.
So the tomato, if you type in tomatoes, that steak and weave will pop up on that publications website.
Right.
And somebody just put in, I don't know if you know, Jenny mentioned that a good trap crop for eggplants is amaranth. That she has found that the beetles will go towards that and leave the eggplants alone. So I haven't tried that one, but
That's
see what
interesting, though. I've definitely seen the flea beetles on the amaranthus. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I've seen them on both too. So
Yeah.
that is interesting. Whether that's effective,
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it draws them to your eggplants.
Yeah, you got.
yeah, right. They might stop off and eat before they go the other. So, but Peter, thank you again. It's always a pleasure to learn about the vegetables,
Yeah.
since I'm not a big vegetable eater. I like to grow them, but I'm not a big eater of them. But that was my first memory of being in the garden was with my grandparents and picking beans and snapping them and sitting eating on the back porch. So always a great time with veggies.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you so
Um,
much. That was great talk.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks.
talk.
Yep.
Thanks for
So
having
yeah,
me.
if we find any more questions that pop in at the end here, we will pass them on your way. And
Okay.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you.
And thank you all for joining us. Those that are still on, we are doing an in-person program in June 16th, Patty.
June 20th.
June 20th on succulent jewelry. So there's going to be a program about growing succulents and then making actually a project with succulents. So you can find that on our website at www.ocean.njaes.rutgers.edu is our website for our RCE of Ocean County. And if you have questions, send us to us in the email that you get with the links, and we will see you all on the other side on the next program. So thanks again, Peter, and have a
you,
great
Peter.
evening, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Okay.
Good night.
Stop the recording. Okay. People, I'll let you know. We'll send everything out, and so you get a copy of it as well, and you'll be able to see yourself immortalized forever.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.
Take care.
Okay.